The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is no substitute for professional care by your doctor or your qualified healthcare professional. Never disregard or delay professional medical advice because of something you've heard on this podcast or in any linked material. Guests who speak on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Dr. Shirley neither endorses nor opposes any particular opinion discussed on this podcast. The views expressed on this podcast have no relation to those of any academic, hospital, practice, institution, or other entity with which Dr. Shirley may be affiliated.
Welcome to Forever FAB, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty. This podcast is curated by Dr. Shirley Madhere, MD, as the definitive source of holistic wellness through beauty.
This week's episode of the Forever FAB Podcast is dedicated to personal truth. The title of this week's episode of Forever FAB is House Rule Number 1, Honor Your Inner Deity. This is my interview with Chef Nicole Layog. Of a multicultural background, Chef Nicole Layog is having a moment, and a really good one. She has been in law enforcement in the past in Florida and also on season 24 of Big Brother. She is now a private chef who is living her best life, and I'm sure she will let us know what she has got going on, because she's got it going on. She joins me today on Streamyard to remind us of how to quote unquote clean house and take a leap of faith, not just once, but again and again. I'm so happy to be having this conversation with her. It's been a work in progress and it has finally come to fruition. Welcome, Chef Nicole. Congratulations on all of your success and more to come. And thank you for becoming a member of this beautiful Forever FAB community. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for that amazing introduction, Dr. Shirley. I feel like from the moment we met, that it's just been one of those conversations where there's so much positivity, such great energy, the idea of connecting with people that you've never met before and just having the ability to kind of speak your truth and be proud of it.
I'm grateful to have met you because you're right. It was like an instant attraction, like energy to energy, aura to aura. I was like, I see you and I like you. Let's do this.
It's one of those things where I feel like there's always that moment when you walk into a room where you don't know anybody and You're wondering, okay, how am I going to connect? How am I going to come across? And then there's also that part of it where there's a little bit of fear because you never know how the interactions are going to go. And are you going to be standing alone? Is there anyone that's going to offer a handout to say hello? And, I think that the way the introductions happen, and I think Marcellus is obviously to thank for the connection and the introduction. And
absolutely.
I just think it was a beautiful moment that we all got to share together.
Absolutely. And big up, shout out to Marcellus for, this introduction. And the other thing I must say that introduced me to you was that glowing, radiant skin that you have, but we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
You were born to Puerto Rican and Filipino parents, and were close to an Italian uncle. So you obviously have a multicultural background. How did this multicultural experience influence your life and how you identified and showed up in the world?
It's so wild because my grandparents, being immigrants from the Philippines, they Americanized my sister and I so much to the point that we only speak English. I do understand a little bit of Spanish. I do understand a little bit of Tagalog, but I'm very proud of both cultures. I'm a chef. I enjoy cooking those Filipino foods and I enjoy cooking those Puerto Rican dishes. And it's wild because it's not that they wanted us to mute ourselves, is that they wanted us to blend in. Mm-hmm. And my sister and I, being one of 3 culturally different families of the elementary school that we went to in New Jersey.
Yes.
We didn't see the diversity. So we were just like, I guess we're like everybody else, but we know that we were a little bit different. So being raised in that environment, we were very Americanized and we were very I guess you can even say we were kind of sheltered because of the neighborhood that I grew up in New Jersey. And then in the late 80s, my family, we moved down to Florida, and that was a culture shock.
I'm
I mean,
sure.
culture shock in religion, culture shock in diversity, seeing other people who look like me and being like, oh, I thought I was the only one.
Oh my gosh. Well, having had that experience and moving and thinking and seeing and observing, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one, but I'm not. How did that affect your childhood? What did you dream about becoming when you were a child?
I know this sounds, it's, I'm at a loss for words in that. And I'm also excited about it because it's wild how that did happen. But I always wanted to be a detective, and I always wanted to be a police officer as a kid. My mom would watch Law and Order. My mom was also addicted to General Hospital. And so there was this family on General Hospital, most amazing soap opera that I think ever to hit TV. And so I fell in love with the idea of being a police officer and investigating crimes. And then growing up, I started watching shows like New York Undercover, and the idea of putting bad people behind bars was so attractive to me, to the point where I did become a police officer. I started my
Yes.
career working at a credit union, working internal audit, then moving on to doing loss prevention and catching shoplifters at, department stores. And then eventually I was hired by the Broward Sheriff's Office, and
Wow.
I became a sheriff's deputy, and I did that for 10 years of my life.
Oh my gosh. I mean, what? But it's deeper than that. I know you watched the shows. I know you were fascinated by it. You wanted to solve crimes. You wanted to put bad people away. But it seems as if you were motivated to want to help deliver justice. Do you find that that's a common thread that emanated perhaps from this, policewoman's job to now?
I think what's wild is that, I think of my childhood, and I think of the obstacles that my mom and my sister and I endured being in an abusive relationship,
Mm,
and um, experiencing, abuse from every angle, and not knowing how to um, deal with that because we were
yeah,
in survival mode from a very young age. I
yeah.
mean, I can remember hiding in a bedroom at the age of 7 and wishing it would just all go away.
Yeah.
And I think that what's why this is so wild, but you mentioned Big Brother, and there was a lot of moments where I felt very muted because there's a part of me that was ashamed of how
Mhm,
my mom and my sister and I were treated.
mhm.
And without trying to victimize myself or
Yes.
trying to tell a story and feel like I was needing, I guess what it comes down to is that I've survived so much from that trauma
Yeah.
that I don't need pity, or I guess it was like one of those things where I was just like, well, I also don't want to put anybody out there and shame anybody.
Right.
But my experience and my mom's experience and my sister's experience was something that we can't brush under the rug. And it has molded me to who I am today. And having that childhood, that's where the hero aspect comes in, where I wanted to be the hero to another kid who was experiencing the same thing that I was.
Mhm.
And for me, being a police officer was just that. I know a lot of people have a lot of pushback towards law enforcement, and they're like, "Oh, it's because you were bullied, and because that's why you're becoming a police officer." And people have a lot of angst and a lot of um, aggression towards police officers. But
Mm.
there are great cops, and yes, there are bad cops, and there's bad
Yes.
apples. But I became a police officer because I wanted to be one of those kids' heroes. I wanted somebody to swoop in. I wanted to be the person to swoop in and save somebody the way that I wish somebody could have swooped in and saved us.
Got it.
And
Yeah.
the only person that saved us in a time where we thought nothing was going to get better was my mom.
Mm,
And, here's a woman who was born blind. She's lived with a disability of being legally blind her entire life, making $11 an hour, working in a nursing home, and not knowing if she was going to be able to support us.
right.
And she finally decided one day, screw this. I'm seeing what my daughters are going through. I'm seeing what I'm going through. And she walked away. And that leap of faith of walking away created the person that I am today,
Yeah.
because that's why I am able to take those leaps of faith. And that's why I am able to take those chances and jump in or jump
Right.
out
Right.
or, make the decision to change.
Right.
And I say it all the time. If you're in a situation that you don't like, if you're not happy, if something is not for you, you can walk away. And what's the worst that could happen?
Right. I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of, because it takes a lot of courage to walk away from what's familiar, and trying to answer the question, or trying to visualize or even think about what's the worst that could happen. That's just not palatable for some people. So what you did took a lot of courage, and obviously your mom, even though she was in there with you going through the hardship, she was always your light. So her actions, her decisions allowed things to change in your life and your siblings' life. So something shifted, and your mom helped that shift to occur. But then something shifted again after you all left, and you decided to attend culinary school. So, what inspired you, and from where did you acquire this passion for food and feeding people? Or is that another form of justice? Nourish people so they can be the strongest and best selves that they could be. So perhaps if there's no one coming to swoop them up, maybe they can help save themselves. So, culinary school, how did that shift happen? Where did it come from?
I was a foodie. I could not cook. I couldn't cook for the life of me at all. I remember the first dish I ever made, chicken parmesan, and it was absolutely horrible. And I give my mom and stepdad a lot of credit for even eating it. But I I fell in love with it. And when I started experimenting and started just trying my own, trying recipes and seeing if I could even make my family recipes, I started realizing that I had a talent. And quite honestly, when I was a police officer, towards the end of my career, I became very tired. Um,
Mm,
I'm working in a position that sometimes can be thankless.
yeah,
We're most police officers, I'm going to say majority of us, and I still say us because it's part of me and it's part of who I am. But we don't do it for the thank yous. We don't, we do it because we get to help and we get to be part of the community. But that's at least my viewpoint in it. I mean, integrity goes a long way. Hard work goes a long way. But as long as I go home alive every night and safe every night to my family, I did my job.
right.
And, but I fell in love with food so much that I said, oh, this might be something that I can turn into a career. And it started out as just doing it for fun. And when I started going to culinary school, I was working shift work. I was working 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., going home, sleeping for an hour, driving from Fort Lauderdale to Miami to culinary school. And I did that for about a year and a half. But then I was promoted to detective. After 2 years of being a detective,
Mhm.
I was exhausted.
Yeah.
I wasn't investigating the crimes that I wanted to. I wasn't investigating the crimes that I was trained for and what my training was in. And I found more love and passion in food. And I realized when people would come over to my home and I would cook these meals and the happiness on their faces, I realized I have a gift. I have a gift and I want to see where it can take me. And, you know, I say this always. I will forever thank my ex-wife for kind of pushing me to follow my heart and pushing me to follow my passion. And June of 2014, I turned in my badge and my ID, and I retired from law enforcement. And I left at the time, a $75,000 a year paying job to making
Wow.
$11 an hour as a butcher.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it was worth it. And here I am now.
So you retired the badge after so many years of delivering justice. Not only did you change careers, you moved out of state.
I did. I left Florida and I never should have came back. No, I'm just kidding. I did. I left Florida, moved to Denver, and it still is like home to me over there. And I'm happy that we made that move and we made the transition, and I never looked back.
Wow.
I don't even know if I answered your question.
No, you absolutely did. I mean, the question essentially was that you moved a few times in your life, right? And many
Yes.
people, myself included, would find not only change of career, the pivot to another career, but then moving in general, whether it's interstate or within the state. Most people would find that stressful. And yet you just packed up, you made a decision, you were like, deuces, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Did that moving, that instability, so to speak, that disruption, did that have any negative impact on your life that you had to bounce back from? Or were you so into the culinary life that it seemed to take care of itself?
It's funny because I feel like I dove so far into the culinary world, and I dove into the idea that I needed to work so much that I'm realizing now that affected my marriage. And, we go through life with a partner and we make these decisions based on the support and based on, what we could do for each other. And I dove into that career so far that I put it ahead of my relationship and I put it ahead of my marriage. And, two people in a marriage, we're both responsible for making things work and we're both responsible for putting the work in. And I think that we did as much as we could to make that marriage work. And I think that we both grew in different ways when we left South Florida. We both had our lives when we uprooted our dogs and our house and our home, and we left and we moved, and it was a fantastic move for both of us. But we grew apart. And I think that it's a blessing and a curse. But when I look at it to 2024 from 2016, I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't change the dynamic of how it all happened. I've learned so much about myself. Therapy saves lives, and lots of therapy, lots of growth, and lots of learning. And, I'm realizing how much I'm still learning today,
Right.
In the relationships that I have had and the relationships that I currently have. And that includes partners and family. And it's wild.
At some point, Chef, you applied to be on the show Big Brother, and you accomplished your goal, appearing on season 24. So now, what was your motivation to A, apply, and B, be on the show, which honestly, I'll be totally honest with you, I have never seen it. And I presume the premise is that you share a house with a bunch of strangers and then let things happen.
Yes, you let things happen. You don't see daylight for 6 days, and you're basically in a pressure cooker setting. In 2021, I've been a fan of the show for many years. And so I feel like when I tell this story, I feel like a robot because it's just, I'm a very factual person. So I just continue to say the same things. And so I applied because I saw the season previous to mine. They had a very monumental alliance called the Cookout. Specifically, one of the members of the Cookout, Tiffany, I fell in love with who she was, and she was the inspiration to the idea of even applying for the show. But shortly before I applied for the show, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And I said to myself, man, I was like, I could do a lot with that. Like winning the $750,000, I will say that that was number one motivation.
Oh
And
my
so
gosh, I didn't realize it was that much.
I wanted to win $750,000 to
Yeah.
one, support me,
Yes.
and two, like do something for my mom. Like it was more of like I wanted to win. I wanted to do this show. And what's so wild is that in applying for the show,
Mhm.
that already in itself was like a surreal moment, like going through the process, all, having to do all these things for production, having to do all these things to secure my position in the show, and interviews and psychological exams and medical exams and doing all these things. And what was so cool was that during that process, you're not allowed to tell anybody anything. It is hush hush. You are like, I was like the best secret keeper. You like, it was one of those moments in my life where when it did happen,
Mhm.
everyone who did not know what was going on, they were like, what is nobody could believe it. Like it was one of those shock factor things.
Yes.
So for me, it was, the idea of doing something. Honestly, I spoke to my mom in length before anything happened. And for her,
Right.
she was like, she already knew. She said, well, you're going to get it. So do it. She says, I'm not dying. I am literally like, yes, we are at a mood point with the cancer. I mean, it was stage 3.
Wow.
We did have some concerns and hesitations, but when you talk about a family who has struggled and who has been through all the things that we've been through, and obviously, I mean, we're not rich. We don't have all the money in the world, but every little bit helps and counts. And so for me, I was like, "God, can you imagine $750,000? Like I could do so much with that money." And
Yes.
and so, like I've never talked about that before, but what I will say is that my mom wouldn't have any medical bills today if I would have won that money. And, it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, they're still paying those off. And here
Right.
we are 2.5 years later.
Years
And,
later, yeah.
we're also just still dealing with a bunch of other stuff. And so it's wild when people ask me, why did you do the show? Did you do it to advance your career? And it's like, no, I was already a successful chef working in yachting, owning a private business for private dining. And so the show was just like an extra credit point. Like it was just, something extra to do, something to see if I could win, and something that I learned a lot of things about myself. And
Well,
that's the
that's priceless.
yeah.
And you
That's
must
the
be
priceless moment.
psychic. You must be psychic because that is my very next question. What did you learn about not only TV and the entertainment industry, but also about yourself from that show or being on that show?
A lot came out of that show.
Mhm.
I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I have no filter. I learned that I do have a big mouth. Uh, I also learned that I am not alone. And
Yeah.
I learned that when moving through anything and being under the limelight,
Mhm.
specifically cameras and a microphone 24/7, um, when you this is wild. It's a big brother thing, and I think that the question you just asked me, it's going to go in like 20 million different directions. So I
I love it.
apologize.
Don't apologize. I love it.
But when your back is up against the wall, and
Mhm.
when you don't have the normal resources that you have in the outside world, we do things and we revert back to behaviors that we had prior to any sort of healing journey that you're on, anything that, you know, possibly that you've learned in therapy. Um, but then you also remember that like survival mode is a thing. And
Yes.
when you're in survival mode, we say and do things that we regret
Yes.
when we feel like we have to defend ourselves or defend the people that you're working with.
Mhm.
And I say that because that's what Big Brother is. We have these alliances and we're trying to make sure that each other stays safe. And, you know, it's so wild because because we were being videotaped and recorded 24/7, you see sides of yourself that you didn't know existed, or you see sides of yourself that you didn't know were part of how you manage emotions and how you manage stress.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like you end up realizing, like, oh, pardon my French, but shit, I'm going backwards now.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the negative part of what Big Brother was is that I went backwards.
Wow.
And it's still taking time. I'm still healing from that experience. I feel
Okay.
like me and anybody else who has been on that show, we are trauma bonded for life.
Wow.
Because we just you're seeing yourself from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I'm even speaking in a direct path of what you're asking.
It is that you're answering the question beautifully.
It's just wild to have a different perspective about it without being so defensive. And
Yeah.
I'll say it. I fucked up. I fucked up while being on that show. And I can't take back anything that I said. I can't take back anything that I did.
Right.
I feel like the best thing that I can do is to continue to move forward and try to mend the things that were broken and that broke the best way that I can, and that I know that it's a continuous process and that it
Right.
all can't be resolved in one day. It all can't be resolved in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I'm still healing and I'm still trying to navigate how to deal with the things that I experienced inside of that house and what I faced when I came out. And
Wow.
the relationships that I'm building are healthy.
Yes.
The relationships that I currently have in my life are because I feel safe. And when it's all said and done, what's wild, and this might sound selfish, but the only people that I care about in this entire experience is my family and how that affected them and what they went through while they saw me on this show.
Yeah.
And it's wild, and this sounds insane, but I know now that the main reason why I went on that show, it had nothing to do with the money. It had
Yes.
nothing to do with image. It had nothing to do with having 10 million followers or 10,000 followers. It had everything to do with my relationship with my sister and how much I was lacking in my personal life and in my
Mhm.
personal relationship with her. And because of that show, I have a sister. And because of that show, I have a relationship with the one person in my life that I experienced real trauma with. And that's, to me, what matters. So, like, I can say that proudly, and I know everything that I went through was my experience, and I know that everything that everybody else went through was their experience.
Right.
But for me, that's what I took from being on Big Brother, is that I now have a relationship with the one person that I was always seeking approval from, that I was always trying to impress. I was always trying to maybe even force something that wasn't there.
Yeah.
But she had to do it in her time and I had to do it in my time. And it's amazing that it took a TV show for that to happen.
So it seems as if, despite or in spite of the trauma from that show, both what you experienced on the show, during the show, and after, though traumatic and dramatic, if I may add,
Yes.
it seems as if that collective experience helped open this path for you to begin to, if you agreed and decided to accept it,
Mhm.
to go on this path of vulnerability and opening.
Yes. I mean, that was very well said.
So in that, so having come from that and still being in the process of undoing to transform,
Mhm.
would you say that you feel free now?
Absolutely. The way I moved through life before I was on the show, very private person. I have I have 9 million friends. I always say this. I have 9 million friends. But it's, it's like I'm finally back to who I was in a space that I can be okay with being by myself and being alone, or choosing to share that space with anybody in my life. So it could be any of those 9 million people, any of my family members, anything like that. I think it's so wild because that show brings up so many different emotions and so many different thoughts. And so when you ask me a specific question, I'm literally having this in real time moment where I'm answering your question. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Like there's just so much more that I would love to like just touch on, but there's not hours in the day to be able to do, a 6-hour podcast.
Well, you are welcome back anytime. So in your newfound freedom to be, to not be, to feel at peace, authentic, yourself, in the full expression of this freedom, what would you be?
Wow. I love that.
Thank you.
Honestly, I'm living it. My freedom is the ability to do what I love, which is cooking. I get to travel and I get to dive into the one thing that I get to express myself every single day. And when I'm cooking, I'm free. When I'm doing what I love, I get to do what I love every single day of my life. And that to me is my freedom. And it's the best feeling in the world.
Not only is it the best feeling in the world, that is fabulous. You're listening to part 1 of my interview with Chef Nicole Layog. Stay tuned to part 2 on the Forever FAB podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Forever Fab, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty, curated by Dr. Shirley Madhere, MD. Live beautifully and help make the world a more beautiful place.